The people of this country have been watching what has been happening in Ukraine. The idea that this man who's going to get a 99.9% vote in Russia today, the idea that he will not stop at Ukraine if he succeeds there is for the birds. We have to wake up.
Armed Forces Minister James Heappey is set to resign, the Times has revealed. Our defence editor, Larissa Brown, saying he's standing down for family reasons, but has been raising frustrations with colleagues. There should be more money for defence. In a letter to his local association, he said he concluded it was time to step away from politics, prioritising his family and pursuing a different career. The opportunity to serve the communities within the Wales constituency for the last 9 years has been the greatest honour of my life, he wrote. He said he would continue to support Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister. Well, here he is, James Heappey, answering a question in the Commons in January.
I think everybody's clear. The Secretary of State has said many times, as have I and other ministerial colleagues, that serial underinvestment in the army over decades has led to the point where the army is in urgent need of recapitalisation. The Chancellor and the Prime Minister get that, and there's a budget coming.
There wasn't very much in the budget for defence, though. So is that what has forced James Heappey to quit? Two serving ministers, Tom Tugendhat and Anne-Marie Trevelyan, have both broken ranks, calling for a much greater pace of investment. Let's speak to Sir Gerald Howarth, a former Conservative defence minister. Gerald, your reaction to James Heappey's resignation against a background of concern about defence spending?
Yeah, well, good morning, Matt. In a way, it's not a huge surprise to me that James has decided to stand down, partly because he's been in post for over 4 years, and it's a pretty grueling job at defence, and has been, of course, hugely ramped up in the last couple of years since Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine, which has raised all sorts of issues for the Ministry of Defence and for the country more generally. Also, that he faces a Liberal Democrat threat in his Wales constituency, though he has a majority of 10,000, and his previous Liberal Democrat opponent, she had a majority of 800. So it's not a foregone conclusion that that seat will fall to the Liberal Democrats at the next election. So it's, pretty grueling stuff. And I think he's also slightly disappointed that he was not appointed Secretary of State for Defence, having served for quite a long time in the department already when Grant Shapps was appointed a few months ago.
Just how serious? I mean, you were in the department for a long time, and you've followed this closely. How serious is what he called the serial underinvestment? I mean, it's not a ringing endorsement for 14 years of Conservative defence secretaries, is it?
No, well, I was one of those ministers responsible for what was a disastrous defence review in 2010, but we inherited a budget deficit of £160 billion from Gordon Brown, and we had to do something. I personally felt at the time, and I said this to the then Secretary of State, my chum Liam Fox, that we're Tories, we should not be cutting defence. I think events have actually proven that to be right. But any Conservative who wants to spend more public money has to say where they would find that money. Also, we need to spend that money more wisely. I always said that I would take the money from the overseas aid budget. I think we should also be looking much more radically at social security. We can't have well over half the people who are on sickness benefit and not even looking for a job. We have got to, I'm afraid, tighten up there, because we face a very real threat to the security of Europe. It is there before our very eyes. The people of this country have been watching what has been happening in Ukraine. The idea that this man who's going to get a 99.9% vote in Russia today, the idea that he will not stop at Ukraine if he succeeds there, is for the birds. We have to wake up. Very great number of Tory, high-ranking Tories have said we need to spend more on defence. The Chancellor of the Exchequer said we need to spend 4% when he was standing for the leadership of the Conservative Party. We have to find that money, but we also have to make that money go further. My son-in-law is the Minister for Defence Procurement, James Cartledge, and he's produced a radical new programme for defence reform, long overdue, very, very straightforward policy set up that he has announced a couple of weeks ago. And we have to spend that money more wisely. We spend £46 billion on defence. And many people will say that actually it's wasted in defence procurement. And then the next generation of combat ships, the new frigates, the first copy is going to cost £1.3 billion for a ship.
Well, we'll see if these warnings are heeded by the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, having now lost a minister. It's Gerald Howarth, good to speak to you, former Conservative Defence Minister, joining us on Times Radio with the news. The Times breaking that news in the last half an hour. That James Heappey is quitting as Armed Forces Minister, having raised frustrations with colleagues about defence spending. Patrick McGuire, Times Radio senior political correspondent, is here. On the very long list of headaches that Rishi Sunak had, this is just another one, isn't it?
Of course. And what's notable about this, as Gerald Howarth just says, is it comes after a week or two of serving ministers criticising the government's failure to spend more on defence. You had the chairman of the Defence Select Committee, Mark Francois, saying similar in the Commons on Monday. So there is clearly a groundswell of Tory opinion, very much in line with what James Heappey is thinking and saying privately, even if he didn't put it in his resignation letter. But let's not forget the more fundamental thing that James Heappey, the MP for a seat the Conservatives won from the Liberal Democrats in 2015 in Somerset, tells us. He's the 62nd Conservative MP to say he's standing down at the next election. He's the second, by the way, to have done so in 12 hours. Brandon Lewis, the former cabinet minister, said that last night too. It just tells us that the morale in the Conservative Party, regardless of their disagreements, in this case substantial disagreement over a big question of policy, is at rock bottom, and experienced former ministers like James Heappey, like Brandon Lewis, are concluding that this show is basically over.
What about this row over the money? The donor, Frank Hester. Turns out that Tortoise reported that he'd given another £5 million, which hasn't yet come out through the full declaration. Is there real pressure on Rishi Sunak to pay that money back?
Of course there is. But then you get into ethical questions about whether one should return the money of someone who's been accused of making racist comments. I know that's a discussion that's bouncing around the Conservative Party. And the more practical questions of, this guy, Frank Hester, is the Conservatives' single biggest donor ever. He donated about 40% of the last Conservative election campaign budget. The spending limits have gone up for this election to £35 million. The Conservatives need all the money they can get. So you've got this sort of pull between politics and practicality. You know, £5 million, even if you're the Conservative Party, is not an easy amount of money to come by in British politics, particularly if you are set to lose that election quite spectacularly.
25 points behind in the polls.